Cade sat in the cockpit of his small, sleek spacecraft, staring out into the endless stretch of stars. He had flown this path countless times, each mission cold and calculated, but this one was different. His fingers tightened around the controls as the planet loomed ahead. Seleni's planet, the frozen world that had been her throne for years. He wasn't sure what to expect, but his orders were clear. Empress Selene had to die. Katie had heard stories about her unyielding reign and how she turned entire systems into ice. The coldest queen, they called her, and for good reason. Her empire stretched across the galaxy, but it was a cold, harsh empire. Cade had been sent to end that reign, to silence the terrifying queen who had earned her place by making others fear her. Fear, not love, and that fear had kept her powerful. His orders had come from the top, from a high-ranking council he couldn't even trust. He didn't care. He'd learned a long time ago that following orders was the only way to survive. It was the only way to stay alive in this cruel universe. But as his ship descended into the icy atmosphere of the planet below, something stirred inside him. There was no room for doubt. He would do his job, as he always had. He was an assassin, trained to handle this kind of task. The planet's surface was a barren wasteland of snow and rock, a reflection of the ruler who called it home. Cade touched down near the Queen's palace, a towering structure made of gleaming metal and glass, rising out of the icy plains like a monument to power. As he stepped out of his ship, the cold bit at his skin, and the wind howled through the empty landscape. The silence was suffocating. There was no sign of life, only the distant hum of machinery in the stark frozen air. Cade made his way to the palace's entrance, where two heavily armed guards stood in silence. They barely acknowledged his presence, but they didn't stop him either. Cade had been here before, on missions, on jobs. He knew the drill. No one stopped him. No one dared. The doors opened before he could even touch them, and he was led through the dark halls of the palace, past statues of the Queen and tapestries that told stories of war and bloodshed. Everything in this palace screamed power. Silent, deadly power. Cade had no interest in the history of it all. He was here to do one thing: execute the Queen. As he moved deeper into the heart of the palace, he began to feel the weight of the mission. His thoughts drifted to the Queen herself. What was she like? Was she as cold and heartless as the stories said? Was she truly as terrifying as they made her out to be? He had only been told the basics. Empress Selene had built an empire that spanned entire systems, crushing any who dared to stand against her. But why? What made her so feared? The universe was a vast, cruel place, but something about her reign seemed different. No one could stand against her for so long without something more than just fear. Cade shook his head. It didn't matter. He was here to do a job. The guards led him to a large chamber where the Queen herself stood, overlooking a vast map of the galaxy. She was tall, draped in black and silver armor, her back straight and regal. Her face was hidden behind a helmet, but Cade knew exactly who she was. The coldest queen, standing in front of him like a statue. But there was something in her stance that made Cade hesitate, just for a second. For the first time in his life, Cade wasn't sure if he could follow through. She turned slowly to face him, her eyes glowing a pale blue beneath her helmet, locked onto his. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Cade could feel the weight of her gaze, the intense pressure of being in the presence of someone so powerful, so dangerous. But there was no fear in her eyes, just cold calculation, as if she had seen 1,000 men like him come and go. "You came," she said, her voice a calm, controlled whisper, barely audible over the hum of the machinery around them. "Oh, I've been expecting you." Cade's hand instinctively went to the weapon at his side. He was ready. He had to be. She was his target. But something in her voice stopped him. It wasn't the tone of someone who had already decided his fate. It was the voice of someone who was waiting for something. "You think I'm just a monster, don't you?" she asked, her words soft but piercing. "You think I'm nothing more than a cold tyrant, ruling with fear and strength alone." Cadet didn't respond. His mind raced. This wasn't what he had been expecting. This wasn't the queen he had heard about. The stories didn't match the woman standing before him. Empress Celine took a step closer, her gaze unwavering.
"You've come to kill me, haven't you?" she said.
"But tell me, assassin, what do you know about me? What do you know about the galaxy I fought to protect?" Cade said nothing, but he could feel the weight of her words pressing down on him. He had been sent to end her reign, but now that he was face to face with her, he wasn't so sure. What if the stories were lies? What if there was more to this queen than he had been told? She didn't wait for him to respond. "You think you're the first to come here to kill me? The first to try and bring me down?"
"I've seen men like you come and go, but you..."
"You are different." Cade's hand tightened around the grip of his weapon. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. He was an assassin. This was supposed to be a quick job. But the longer he stood in front of her, the more he felt the cold pull of uncertainty. Celine's helmeted face tilted slightly, and her voice grew softer, almost like a whisper. "Do you think killing me will change anything? Do you think it will end the wars, end the suffering?" She paused, her gaze never leaving his. "If you truly understood the galaxy, you would know that death isn't the answer." Cade's grip on his weapon loosened slightly. He didn't know what to think anymore. His mission had always been clear, to kill the queen and end her reign. But now, standing in her presence, it all felt like a lie.
"You don't have to do this," she said, her voice calm and measured. "You don't have to follow through with the orders they've given you."
"You have a choice." Cade could feel the weight of her words, like a slow burning fire starting to creep into his mind. Was this really the mission he was meant to complete? Could he turn back now? Or was it too late? He didn't know the answer, but one thing was certain. He wasn't going to make the decision yet, not until he understood more. Not until he saw who this woman really was. "Tell me, assassin," she said, her tone softer now, almost inviting.
"Do you still think I'm the enemy?" Cade didn't answer. Instead, he turned and walked toward the door.
His mission wasn't over, but for the first time, he didn't feel so sure of what would happen next. Cade's footsteps echoed in the cold silence as he walked through the palace corridors. The air was thick with tension, and the walls seemed to close in around him. He had been sent to end the life of Empress Celine, but every step he took away from her chambers made him question his mission more and more. The palace was far quieter than he had expected. There were no sounds of guards marching in formation or distant cries of those who had crossed the queen. Instead, it felt almost still. Peaceful, in a way. But that peace was deceptive, Cade knew. The Empress had built her empire on fear, and there was no peace in fear. Cade had been trained for moments like this, trained to kill, to never second guess. But standing before Celine, everything he had ever believed seemed to shift. She was unlike any ruler he had ever encountered. Cold, yes, but not without reason. Her strength wasn't just physical, it was in her mind, her words, and the way she controlled the world around her. She wasn't just a tyrant, she was a leader who had shaped the galaxy with the harshest methods. As Cade entered a small room deep within the palace, he found himself standing before a large window, staring out over the desolate landscape below. The snow was falling softly now, a quiet blanket covering the icy planet. He couldn't understand it. This was the planet that had birthed the Coldest queen, and yet here he was, caught in a web of questions he had never expected to ask. The door behind him clicked shut, and Cade turned to see the shadow of one of the palace's guards standing in the doorway. It was a silent figure, barely moving, as though it was just waiting for him to acknowledge it. "Empress Celine requests your presence." The guard's voice was calm, almost emotionless. Cade nodded, though he didn't move immediately. He still felt the weight of her words, the ones she had spoken to him just moments before. "Do you still think I'm the enemy?" What had she meant by that? Was she truly the monster the galaxy thought she was? Or had he been sent here to destroy a woman who only wanted to protect what was hers? It was impossible to ignore the doubt creeping into his thoughts. But there was no room for doubt in his line of work. He was an assassin. He killed. That was his purpose.
There was no time for hesitation, yet here he was, frozen in a moment of indecision.
The guard stepped aside, and Cade moved through the doors into the heart of the palace once more. He was led back to the grand chamber where he had first seen the queen, but now it felt different. The coldness in the room wasn't just from the temperature. There was a tension in the air, a subtle shift in the atmosphere, as though everything around him was holding its breath. Empress Selene was waiting for him once again, her form standing tall and commanding before a massive table covered in holographic displays. She didn't turn when he entered. Instead, she kept her eyes fixed on the swirling lights in front of her. She seemed to be studying something, her face unreadable beneath the mask of her helmet. Cade's steps were slow as he approached. He wasn't sure what to say, or even if there were words to say. What did you say to someone like her? Someone who had created an empire from nothing, built it with ruthless hands and an iron will? "Come in, Cade," she said, her voice calm, without the biting edge he had expected.
I know you are struggling with this mission. Cade didn't respond immediately. He wasn't sure what to say.
He had never hesitated before, never questioned an order. But Selene's presence was powerful, and in her quiet authority, he felt the pull of something he had never felt before. Her voice wasn't full of threats or demands. It was filled with understanding. She didn't need to raise her voice to make her presence known. "You have questions, don't you?" she asked, finally turning to face him. Her gaze was steady, unwavering. She was calm, almost serene, and it unsettled him. The queen of the galaxy, a woman who had destroyed countless enemies, was looking at him with no hint of fear or anger. Instead, she seemed almost resigned. "I don't know what I'm supposed to think anymore," Cade admitted, his voice quiet. The words felt strange coming from him, as though he had never said them before. But the longer he stayed in her presence, the harder it became to deny the truth. "I was sent here to kill you. But something about this doesn't feel right." Selene didn't respond immediately. She simply watched him, as if weighing his words. Her eyes were calculating, but there was something else in them too. A sadness, perhaps. She took a step closer, her movements slow and deliberate. "Do you think I want this?" she asked, her voice low. "Do you think I wanted to rule? To become this monster the galaxy believes me to be?" Cade's brow furrowed. This wasn't the queen he had been told about. The stories painted her as a tyrant, someone who ruled with fear and power alone. But this was a woman, not a monster. A woman who had been forced into a role she hadn't chosen.
"You were born into power," Kadi said, trying to steady his voice.
"You don't become empress without a desire for control. People like you, people like me, don't get power without taking it, without crushing those who get in our way." Selene shook her head slowly, almost regretfully. "That's what they want you to believe," she said softly. "That's what they've all been led to believe. That's what the galaxy wants to believe." She paused, her eyes locking onto his. "But it's not true. I didn't want this. I didn't want to be this. This empire. This throne. It was thrust upon me." Cade's mind raced. He had never considered that. He had always thought power was something you fought for, something you claimed. It was the way of the universe. The strong survived, and the weak were crushed. But this was different. She wasn't speaking like a conqueror. She wasn't speaking like a ruler who reveled in her power. She was speaking as someone who had been burdened with it. "You were forced into it?" Cade asked, his voice tinged with disbelief.
How? Celine let out a breath, as if the question had brought a weight to her chest. My family was murdered.
My homeworld was destroyed, and I was left with nothing but the remnants of an empire that had already begun to fall apart. I didn't want to rule. Kade. I didn't want to become the monster they say I am. But I had no choice. The words hung in the air like a thick fog. Cade could hardly process them. This wasn't what he had expected at all. This wasn't what he had been sent to destroy. I built this empire not because I wanted to, but because I had to, she continued. And to do so, I had to become something I never thought I would be. I had to become the Coldest queen, because that was the only way to protect those who still followed me. Kadi stared at her, feeling the weight of her words settle in. He had been sent to kill a tyrant, to end a reign of terror. But he hadn't been sent to understand her. No one had told him to look beyond the surface. They had told him to pull the trigger and walk away. But now he didn't know if he could. The silence between them stretched out for a long moment. Cade could feel the weight of his decision pressing down on him, suffocating him. He had come here to kill. But now he was caught in a storm of doubt. What was he supposed to do? What was he supposed to believe?
Celine's voice broke through his thoughts.
You don't have to follow through with this, Cade. You don't have to follow through with this, Cade.
You don't have to be their puppet. Cade met her gaze, his mind whirling with everything he had just learned. I don't know what to do, he whispered. Celine stepped closer to him, her eyes filled with something he couldn't quite place. Maybe understanding, maybe pity, maybe something else. You still have a choice, she said softly, and I will give you time to think. Think about what's right, not what they've told you. Cade didn't know if he would ever be able to make the right choice, but for the first time in his life he wasn't sure what the right choice was anymore. The days following Cade's meeting with Empress Celine passed in a blur. His mind, once so sharp and focused, now felt clouded with doubt and confusion. He had come to this planet to end the life of a cold, unfeeling tyrant, but instead he had found a woman, a leader, perhaps even a victim of circumstances, caught in a situation she never wanted. Cade spent the next few days in his quarters, unable to shake the weight of her words. He had trained for this mission for years, prepared to face any threat, to kill without hesitation. But this wasn't what he had been prepared for. There was no clear enemy here, no black and white division between good and evil. The lines had blurred, and Cade didn't know where he stood anymore. The silence in his room was oppressive. Every time he tried to focus, to think about the mission, his mind drifted back to the Queen. He couldn't stop thinking about the sadness in her eyes when she had spoken of her past, about how she had been forced into the role of an emperor with no choice but to harden herself against the galaxy's cruelty. He had always believed that power was taken by force, that it was something to be earned, no matter the cost. But now he wasn't sure if that was the case at all. Cade's training had always told him to follow orders, to complete the mission and move on. But the more time he spent on this planet, the more time he spent thinking about what Celine had told him, the harder it became to do so. The Emperor had never been the monster he had imagined. Instead, he had found a person who had been shaped by years of war, betrayal, and loss. He paced back and forth in his room, running his hand through his hair in frustration. He didn't know what to do anymore. There were no clear answers. His mission was to kill her. He knew that. His superiors had made it clear. But as he walked through the cold palace halls, meeting with the Queen and hearing her side of the story, it felt more like he was betraying her than fulfilling his orders. The weight of his decision grew heavier with every passing hour. The more Cade thought about it, the less he could bring himself to see Celine as the enemy. She had shown him kindness, something he hadn't expected. She had given him a chance to understand her, to see beyond the stories he had been told. And in doing so, she had cracked the armor around his heart. He didn't want to admit it, but he was beginning to see her not as the cold, ruthless queen the galaxy feared, but as a woman who had fought for her survival, someone who had been trapped by forces beyond her control. Cade felt conflicted. He wasn't supposed to care. He was an assassin. He was trained to be emotionless, but it wasn't so easy now. It wasn't so simple. The next day, Cade found himself standing at the edge of the palace grounds, looking out at the frozen landscape. The wind whipped through his hair, and the cold air bit at his skin, but he didn't move. His thoughts were too heavy for him to care about the chill. A voice broke the silence, soft and calm.
You're thinking too much, Cade. He turned to see Celine approaching, her figure framed by the icy landscape. She was wearing her armor as always, but there was something different in her presence today.
She didn't seem as imposing as she had before. She seemed human.
Just like him. Can't help it, Cade replied, his voice strained.
I came here to kill you, to stop your reign. But now, I don't know what to think. Celine stopped beside him, her gaze drifting out over the frozen landscape.
It's hard to see the truth when you've been told lies your whole life, she said, her voice gentle. Cade nodded, though he wasn't sure if he agreed.
His mind was a battlefield of conflicting emotions. He had been trained to think in black and white, but now everything was shades of gray. He didn't know how to fight this battle.
You're not the monster they say you are, Cade finally admitted, his voice low. But that doesn't mean I can just let you go.
If I don't follow through with this mission, what happens to everything you've built? What happens to the galaxy? Celine turned to face him, her expression soft, but filled with resolve.
The galaxy doesn't need to be ruled with fear, Cade, she said. I didn't build this empire to control the galaxy.
I built it to protect my people. I built it to give them a chance to survive. Cade shook his head, frustration growing within him. And what about everyone else? The ones who suffered under your rule? What about the ones who died because of your choices?
Celine's gaze hardened, but not with anger.
It was the look of someone who had lived through pain, through decisions no one should have to make. I never wanted anyone to suffer, she said.
But sometimes survival comes at a cost. I couldn't save everyone, Cade.
I couldn't protect them all. And now I'm paying the price for that. The weight of everything I've done, it's more than I can carry sometimes. Cade didn't know what to say to that. He had always seen the world in terms of victories and failures, of right and wrong. But Celine's words made him question everything. She wasn't the enemy. She was a ruler who had made hard choices, ones he couldn't even begin to understand. And yet, despite everything, she was still standing. She was still fighting for what was left of her empire.
I didn't choose this, Cade, she continued, her voice softening. None of us ever do. Shut.
We're all just trying to survive, trying to protect what we have left. I never wanted to be the coldest queen. I never wanted to rule with fear, but when you're faced with a galaxy that wants to tear you apart, you do whatever it takes to keep your people safe. Cade felt the weight of her words settle in his chest. She wasn't a monster. She was just a person who had been forced into a position where every choice was a bad one. And now, standing here with him, she was asking for a chance to change, to rebuild. But could he trust her? Could he trust the queen who had built her empire on fear? Could he let go of everything he had been taught? I don't know what to do, Cade said, his voice barely a whisper. I don't know what's right anymore. Celine's eyes softened, and she took a step closer.
You're not alone in this, Cade. You don't have to make this decision by yourself. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. For the first time since he had arrived on this planet, Cade felt the smallest flicker of hope. Maybe there was another way. Maybe the path forward wasn't about following orders, about carrying out a mission that no longer made sense. Maybe it was about something more, about understanding, about compassion,
and about making the right choice for once. Cade stood there for a long moment, the cold wind whipping around them both. He didn't have the answers. He didn't know what the future held. But as he looked at Selene, standing beside him, he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't the same man who had arrived on this planet, and he wasn't sure what that meant for his mission anymore. Cade stood on the balcony of the palace, looking out at the vast, frozen landscape that stretched as far as the eye could see. The wind howled around him, a constant reminder of the harsh world that had given birth to the Coldest queen. But today, the cold didn't feel the same. It wasn't just a bitter chill anymore. It felt like a weight pressing down on him, making everything heavier. Every decision he had made, every choice he had believed to be the right one, felt like it was slowly slipping through his fingers. The galaxy was a cruel place, that much was certain. But Cade had never expected to find himself caught between the cold reality of his mission and the warmth of a woman who, in so many ways, had become something more than just a target. Empress Selene was not the monster the galaxy thought she was. She was a ruler, a survivor, doing what she could to protect her people. Yet there was still the question that haunted Cade's every thought. What was the right thing to do? The door behind him opened, and Cade didn't need to turn to know who it was. He could feel her presence even before she spoke. Empress Selene had become more than just a figure of power to him. She had become someone he could no longer ignore, someone who made him question everything he had ever believed. "You're still thinking about it, aren't you?" Selene's voice was soft, but there was an unmistakable edge to it. She had been watching him, waiting for him to make a decision. She was patient, but even she knew that time was running out. Cade didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned and looked at her. She stood in the doorway, her silhouette framed by the soft glow of the palace lights. She was strong, but there was a vulnerability in her eyes that he hadn't noticed before. She had shown him that she was more than just a queen. She was a person, one who had been shaped by circumstances beyond her control.
"I've never been given the luxury of time before," Cade said finally, his voice rough. "I've always just been told what to do."
I kill. I move on. But now
I'm stuck." Selene nodded slowly, her gaze never leaving his. "I know the feeling. I've been stuck for a long time, Cade. Stuck in a role I never wanted, surrounded by people who only see me for what I've become, not for who I am."
Cade swallowed hard. He wasn't used to being this open, this vulnerable. He had spent his life keeping his emotions in check, locking them away behind walls he had built. But with her, those walls were starting to crack, and he didn't know if that made him stronger or weaker. "What happens now?" he asked quietly, his voice almost a whisper. "You said we still have a choice. But I don't know what the right choice is." Selene took a step forward, her expression softening.
"The right choice isn't always clear, Cade. It never is.
But we can choose what kind of world we want to live in. We can choose to break the cycle, or we can keep going down the same path we've always been on."
Cade stared at her, unsure of what she meant.
And you think we can change everything? After all this time, after everything you've done, you think we can fix it? Selene didn't hesitate. "I know it's not easy."
"I know it won't happen overnight, but I can't keep running from the truth. And neither can you." She paused, her voice softer now. "You're not just an assassin, Cade. You're a person. You have the power to make a difference."
If you stay on the path you've been given, you'll become just like everyone else. But if you make the choice to stand with me, to fight for something better, then maybe, just maybe, we can change the galaxy together.
Cade felt the weight of her words sink in. He had never thought of himself as anything more than a weapon, something to be used to carry out orders. But now, for the first time in his life, he could see a different path. A path that didn't involve blindly following orders, a path that led to something more meaningful. It wasn't easy. and it wasn't guaranteed, but it was a chance.
I don't know if I can do this, Cade admitted, his voice barely audible.
Celine smiled gently, as though she understood exactly what he was feeling. None of us ever know if we can.
We just have to try. For a long moment, Cade and Celine stood there, the silence between them filled with everything unspoken.
He had always been the one who decided the fate of others, but now, for the first time, he had to decide his own fate. Finally, Cade took a deep breath and nodded. "All right," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "I'm with you." Celine's expression softened, and she took a step closer, her presence comforting yet powerful.
Then let's make sure we don't make the same mistakes again, together. Cade knew there was no going back.
The mission had changed. It wasn't about killing the Queen anymore.
It wasn't about following orders. It was about something bigger.
It was about fighting for a future where the galaxy could finally be free from the cycle of war, power, and fear that had ruled for so long. But the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There were still those who wanted to see Celine fall, who wanted to see her empire crumble, and Cade knew that the hardest battles were still to come. The galaxy wouldn't change overnight, but he was willing to fight for it now. He was willing to fight for her, for the future they could build together. And so, as Cade stood beside Celine, he knew that the real battle was just beginning. But for the first time in his life, he wasn't facing it alone. The days ahead would be filled with challenges, and their enemies would be relentless. But Cade was ready to face them. He wasn't the same man who had arrived on this planet. And he wasn't the same man who had been sent to execute a queen. He was someone new now, someone who had chosen a different path. Together, Cade and Celine would fight for a galaxy that had been ruled by fear for too long. They would fight for a chance to rebuild, to offer hope to those who had been oppressed for far too long. The galaxy may have feared her before, but now they would see a different side of the Coldest Queen. And Cade would stand beside her, ready to face whatever came next.